a philosopher. Oh,
Sorry.
that's okay. Would you like me to jump back so you have a?
I think that would be lovely if the rest don't mind.
Okay. Well, hello all, and the camera. So my name is Feradacus filium Tralini, and this class is the life in the medieval university. So we'll be talking about the history of the university system, how it came about, what kind of topics were studied, and what life was like for the students and the teachers who lived there. So the university system started in a period of time called the 12th century Renaissance, which lasted from about 1050 to 1250. And there were three main features of this 12th century Renaissance that helped create the university systems and drive them forward. The first of those is new translations of Aristotle. So, as all of us know, Aristotle was a philosopher, a Greek philosopher in BC, who was very prolific, wrote on all sorts of topics, and especially on logic and sort of the rules for how to think. His most influential work is known as the Organon, which is a set of 6 books that basically lay out the rules of how logical argumentation works. He has his categories to talk about how you can sort the world into different types of things, the difference between um, like run as a verb and or run as movement and run as um, make things happen, all that kind of the system for understanding those logical differentiations and all sorts of other relatively interesting and pointed philosophical and logical argumentation. He also, however, only 3 of those books were really available before this 12th century Renaissance. So a lot of his books got lost to time. And then there were 2 prolific Islamic writers, Averroes and Avicenna, who the books of Aristotle had gone over to the Islamic world and to the Persian Empire and had been translated and studied over there. And so during the beginning of this 12th century Renaissance, those translations came back to Europe and were translated back into Latin. And this created a big revival in studying Aristotle, this new concepts, these new books that they could really chew on. So there was a lot of the to this new information from Aristotle, and especially these new perspectives, because there's they included commentary, and so the Islamic thinkers having a different tradition had an entirely different perspective, and so the new researchers in Europe had not only the new Aristotle to study, but the new perspectives and research on Aristotle to study and merge that in to the European tradition. So the second intellectual development was an increased focus on argumentation rather than just reliance on authority. So an example of this thinking is there are 3 medieval philosophers who believed that reason and argumentation should be used to discuss church doctrine, namely Anselm, Abelard, and Aquinas. And it's important to note that they didn't believe that the veracity of the scriptures should be questioned or that we should discard any of the church dogmas, but rather they engaged in what's called apologetics, which is the use of logical argumentation to prove the truth of scripture and religious teaching. And then also to discover the logical consequences that come from those religious teachings. So we have the scripture, they study its logical argumentation and can deduce how Christians should behave in other parts of their life based on both logic and the sources you have. However, their attempts to integrate logical argument with the scripture led to an increase in the prominence of argumentation as an art form itself, and in students seeking to engage in this dialogue and this tool of being able to debate. So looking at those 3 big figures, the first one, Anselm of Canterbury. So he lived from 1033 to 1107. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and his big belief was that reason was another method for reaching God. So, God created man, man has intelligence, therefore intelligence and reason is a tool that God gave us to understand him. And so he explored how reason and logical argumentation would lead us to faith. Peter Abelard lived from 1079 to 1142, and he was a wandering master who taught shortly before the rise of the universities in Paris. So he focused on examining church doctrine via debate as a way of gaining a better understanding of the doctrine. So his most famous work is called, I believe it's Is or Is Not. I forget the Latin translation name for it. Is or Is Not, I believe. And it basically proposes here's a dogma, here's an argument, is it true or false? Is it right or wrong? Here's an argument for it, argument against it. And the goal was to get people to understand the types of arguments that could be made and therefore have better, stronger arguments. But some in the church felt that his debating style went too far, and so he wound up being censored by the church for many years. And the last one, Thomas Aquinas. So he lived from 1224 to 1274. And he was actually part of the university system. He studied and taught in Paris, and then helped in the founding of the University of Naples. And his main work was merging Aristotle and church doctrine. So it was controversial when he was originally doing in the day, but since then he's been recognized as one of the greatest medieval philosophers and theologians and doctors of the church, and was the one who really solidified the idea that Aristotle is the philosophy of the Catholic Church, at least for the Middle Ages. So the third development was the actual rise of the university system itself. So the process of establishing the schools happened over a broad period of time. So we can go all the way back to the Roman Empire. So the Roman state was one that was highly prized education and often requiring it for service in office. And the history of education here is tied to the year 529, which so the German philosopher Hegel marked as a transition from the Roman age to the medieval age. And the reason for that specific year is that was the year the Platonic Academy in Athens, which had been operating for about 900 years, was closed down. So it transferred the educational system from the secular Platonic Academy of Athens because in the same year to the church, because in the same year, Saint Benedict founded the first monastery. And so the education moved from the secular philosopher sphere into the church, as it was kept in the churches and in the monasteries, who would then keep that education going. So the cathedral schools really started coming about in 789 when Charlemagne the Great made a decree that all monasteries and cathedrals need to run free schools for children. So the plan wasn't fully implemented during his lifetime, but it did start the process so that large cathedral schools such as Chartres would reformed and would take on students and teach them not just the doctrines of the church, but would also teach them general education they needed to become well-rounded adults. So the real foundation of the universities began in the beginning of the 1200s as students would gather in locations, students and teachers would both gather in locations. So Bologna had some famous lawyers and legal scholars such as Enurius, who were teaching, and students would come from across the continent to learn from them. Same with Paris, with Abelard being their biggest star in the city of Paris. And then once all these students and masters gathered together to learn with each other, they began to build institutions to support them. So the universities started not as like formal institutions, but rather as more of guilds of learners and teachers. These guilds were formed to secure protection and power for the individuals who were often strangers and lacked a lot of connections to the local institutions. The laws that protected, given the feudal system, the laws that protected the citizens of a region often didn't protect the strangers in a region. And so the the universities, which the word university literally just means a group, a gathering. So these universities or universitas were formed as guilds by the students or by the masters in order to provide themselves protection and legal status within the town. As they grew, they gained a unique character that was distinct from the town they lived in, and this led to what were called town and gown conflicts. So this would arise when the town would want to take advantage of students, like exorbitant rents, or when the students would go carousing and cause issues. So the resolution to these town and gown conflicts, where the university and the town would try to butt heads with each other, was almost always that the universities eventually wound up being granted special laws and special governance through papal decrees. So they joined as part of the church because they were descended from the cathedral schools. And because of the way medieval law is set up, they were no longer under the purview of the local town, the local mayor. They were governed by church law. And so the town, for instance, couldn't punish students who committed crimes like murder, but the university would be the one to punish them. The primary tool that universities used to enforce that power they had was a strike. So the students or masters would simply leave the town, thus depriving it of the prestige and economic impact that the school brought. The most famous example, or a famous example of this, is when the students and masters of Oxford went on strike in 1209, and they formed the Cambridge as a competing institution while they waited for the town authorities of Oxford to submit to their demands. So there are two major types of universities: the Universitas Scholarium, which is a university of students, and the best example of this is in Bologna. So this one began as students organized as a guild, and then those students would hire teachers to train them. So the universities there were based on the home location of the students. So there was, it started as one for Italians and one for non-Italians, and eventually grew into 17 different universities, which all merged as time went on into the single school of Bologna. The Universitas Magistrorum, such as Paris, those were formed by the masters. So when Abelard and other famous teachers were in Paris, they formed their own guild to control the giving away of licenses and to work with the cathedral that what used to be in charge of that. And then as they formed their own university, the students would come to them and apply to learn from them. So both universities contain guilds of the other type. So the Bologna University had a master's guild as well, and the Paris had some student guilds. But the distinction was really in which of the two sides of the debate formed the whole organization and therefore had the most power. And so obviously universities that were founded by masters had a lot more restrictions on what student behavior could be, versus the ones founded by students had far more restrictions on what the master's behavior could be, and like tuition and things like that. The other type of grouping that group we'll see is the collegium or the college. So the colleges were generally more focused on, say, giving students housing and like-minded peers. So similar to a fraternity, um, these were definitely lesser groups, and they could be formed by, say, rich patrons who wanted to ensure that um, they would form a college and pay for an endowment for it so that students who went there would then come back to their region of the country and be priests or other professionals that patron felt were necessary. So the change where the universities moved from just a collection of individuals who are in a guild to an actual organization as we recognize them today was with the rise of the Studium Generale, which were established through papal bull as an independent organization, and they had three main features to them. The first were that they had to accept students from anywhere. The second, they were given self-governing authority, so they were governed by the church laws and governed themselves rather than being judged by the local area. And then the third and most important was the Ius ubiqui docindi, which is the right to give out licenses or licenses to teach, or the licentia docindi. So the idea was any person who had this license could go to any other university or any other studium and would automatically be accepted as a teacher. And so this generalization allowed a student to travel from England to Paris, learn, and then go teach in Bologna. And so that created the system we have today where all universities are recognized roughly as equals and it's and share similar concepts and similar curriculums so that the whole of the community has a roughly consistent type of education. So the curriculum that was taught in these schools, the first part of it is what's called the liberal arts. So the liberal arts go all the way back to the Lyceum, which was run by Aristotle. And these specific topics were valued by the Romans and considered necessary to being a well-educated system. And then they were transmitted from the Roman world to the medieval world by a writer called Martianus Capella, who wrote a book called The Marriage of Philology and Mercury. And this book is an allegory where Mercury, the god of eloquence and youth, is getting married to philology, the love of learning. And philology introduces her 7 handmaidens who represent these 7 liberal arts, or the 7 topics that you need to be or need to understand to be a fully educated human. So the liberal arts are broken into 2 different sections. There's the trivium, which focuses on language and logic, and the quadrivium, which focuses on mathematics. So the trivium was always considered the most important. And these are, often the Roman and even the university system would focus all their attention on the trivium, and the quadrivium was sort of an afterthought. But the 3 parts of the trivium were grammar, so the study of writing and language, always Latin. Logic, so this, which is exactly what we think of it, logic, logical argumentation, Aristotle, and in the university system, logic came to be the largest focus they had. And then the third piece is rhetoric, which is the study of argumentation and debate. And for the Romans, that was the biggest one they focused on, especially legal cases. The quadrivium, as I mentioned, focuses on mathematics. And the Boethius, who was another the translator of Aristotle from the 400s, who transmitted Aristotle from the Roman world to the medieval world, describes these as the four pieces of mathematics. So for him, arithmetic is abstract measurement, sort of a number theory. So it's the idea of what is it? It's not adding, subtracting, but it's more understanding the concepts of evens and odds and prime numbers. And then geometry is the measurement of space. Astronomy is the measurement of time, because before clocks, the only way to calculate what day of the year you are, when the seasons are, is all by the movement of the stars and the rising of the sun in different locations. And then music is the measurement of ratios. So when they studied music, it was never music as performance, it was music as music theory. So the scales, ratios, harmonies, things like that. Once a student had finished their study of the liberal arts, which was usually done in your bachelor degree, then you could move on to the three philosophies, which were all based on Aristotle. So these were the primary focus of the universities and the real heart that drove their existence. So the first philosophy is natural philosophy, which we today call science, so study of the natural world. Ethical philosophy, which is the study of ethics, and then metaphysical philosophy, and which can study religion, but also the primary thing they studied is what's called the question of universals. So this is the metaphysical nature of concepts that can't really exist outside of an object, like bigness. What is bigness? Is there such a thing? Can you separate bigness out of all objects and talk about bigness itself, or is bigness only residing inside things? Once a student so completing the three philosophies is really what distinguished from a bachelor's of arts into a master's of arts. And then after that would be the doctoral topics. These were considered the more practical studies, and while important, and some of Bologna was really focused on civil and canon law, and Paris was really focused on theology, but they were always considered slightly less necessary. It was the masters of arts, the philosophies that were sort of the heart, and what still remains today, the thing that makes a university university. But the four doctoral degrees people could get were in medicine, canon law, which is church law, a civil law, which was always based on the Code of Justinian, even for countries like England that didn't use the Code of Justinian, so Roman law, and then theology. So in the universities, when a new student arrived in the university, the first thing they really encountered was what was called the nation system, which was the subgroups of the universitas. So students would be grouped based on where they arrived on. So in Paris, the groups were the French, the Normans, the Picards, and Picardia is upper northeast section of France and England. So in Bologna, they were broken into two subgroups. So there's the Transalpine and the Cisalpine. So the Transalpine nations were Spain, Gascony, Provençal, Normandy in England, and the Cisalpine nations were Lombard, Tuscany, and Rome. So the students and the masters can be governed by these different nations, and each of the nations would elect an official. They were called proctors in Paris or consulars in Bologna, who would then, those officials would get together and elect a rector, who is the head of the university. So the type of university, whether it's a master's or a student's university, would determine which group of people got to vote. So in Paris, the masters would vote and would elect the rectors, while in Bologna, the students would be the ones who voted and elected the rector to run the school. So the rector was the head of the university and held sway over the studium and the awarding of degrees. So ultimately, it was the rector who and his council who set the rules for the school and determined who did and didn't get a degree from the school. And the third interesting thing, very different from what we have, is the building system. So when the universities began, all the teaching was happening in private houses and rented halls. So often the masters would teach out of their own houses, but if the students, there were too many students, they might find a public place or rent a hall. And this was really important. So because since the power of the school, the ability to enforce their rules and their privileges came from the ability to go on strike, the lack of physical buildings meant they could literally just pick up and leave the whole town. So by the 1400s, the need to fight for their right to exist and their privileges had diminished. And with the growth of students, we started to see permanent buildings begin to rise up for the schools. So when students first arrived at the college, they were already expected to be fluent in Latin. So the all the training happened in Latin. Students, the entrance exam was an oral exam that was held completely in Latin, and students would be fined if they spoke any words in the vernacular. There's a rule in, I believe it's Oxford, that says if you speak more than 5 words in a row in the vernacular, you have to pay a fine. So because of this, the grammar portion of the liberal arts had to be learned beforehand before you got to college. And these were taught in grammar schools for children because you could reach the universities in your early teens. So that is part of where we get the name for elementary schools being called grammar schools. So the value of learning Latin was, first of all, that so much of the text was pulled from Roman or church sources, and so everyone could read all the same sources, and so it could be learning from the same books. But also, since students came from everywhere, the fact that every student had to learn Latin meant that you could have Greeks and Romans and Germans and English all talking together in a shared language. So there are 3 main teaching techniques that were used in the schools to transmit the information. So the first of those, the lectio or lectures, involved the teacher reading a text and then lecturing on the commentaries to the text. So this was always very pushed to the students. So questions really weren't allowed. The students were sometimes they would be required to sit on the floor so that they would remember that they're below the masters. Some schools actually forbade them to have any writing utensils because they wanted them to memorize the lectures rather than write them down. So the lectures can be divided into 2 types. The ordinary lectures, which would read a full text, usually no more than a chapter, and these were done by the licensed masters. So the ordinary lectures were generally what were required. They were the hard lectures, and what would be the sort of the main curriculum. The extraordinary lectures were usually smaller sections of text, and these could be delivered by graduate students. So, like today, where you get your bachelor's degree and then in training for your master's degree, you will teach texts or teach classes. In the medieval universities, those students working on their master's degree or their graduate degree would teach those extraordinary lectures. So the disputatio or the disputation is where the question and answer section came about. So this involved the teacher defending a thesis by taking questions from students about the position. So they would put forth some position, and then the students, and then either, or sometimes teachers, would question them, try to find logical debate about this topic. And then the third technique they really used was the repetito, or the repetition, which involved reading important passages from the lectures. So this would often be done, say, during meal times. So you would have the lecture in the morning, and then at the mealtime, evening mealtime, you would either have an assistant teacher or student who would stand up and just reread a part of the lectures so that people could memorize them better. So in order to graduate, a student needed to perform their own disputatio and defend a position against questioning masters. So this was for every graduate degree, or every moving from bachelor's to master's to doctorate. That was the main thing they had to do, is defend a thesis, somewhat like we do today. To get a degree, so we can look at Oxford from roughly 1250 for their requirements. So for a bachelor's, they had to have 4 years of training and focus on the trivium. To get a master's degree, they needed to do another 3 years of training, and they had to cover all of the liberal arts and the three philosophies and do some lecturing. And then for a doctoral degree, depending on which group they were going into, if they were doing medical, they would do 6 years. Canon law was 5 years, civil law was 4 years, and theology was 5 years. So the life in the universities was both an exciting exploration of the frontiers of philosophy, as well as the drudgery of memorizing the words and arguments of dead philosophers. So the age-old struggle between contributing new knowledge to the world and absorbing existing knowledge so you have a firm foundation was present in the earliest universities and is still with us to this day. That is stop share. Right. So I hope you enjoyed the class, and I will go ahead and drop in a link to a lot of the resources I was using in the chat, and I can, oh, yes, that is, sorry, I didn't see there's a message,
That's
but
okay.
yes, that is sort of that is the foundation of it. It's pretty much exactly what it is. For bachelor's degrees, there would be pre-handed a thesis to defend, and then as they get the higher degrees, they would find their own theses to defend.
So they probably wouldn't think much of my bachelor's degree, considering that so little of it covered any of the subjects in your lecture.
Yeah, and that was one of the movements as we moved out of the Renaissance. The humanism movement was part of a push to broaden what was considered the topic of a university degree.
Mhm.
I was fascinated to see how much has carried over.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's really interesting. I know one of the authors I was reading on spoke of that exact thing, how it's out of all the institutions from the medieval world, the university system is the one that seems to have survived the best and the strongest and most intact to the day.
Yeah, sadly, perhaps for not much longer, considering how little esteem it has among certain sectors of the population these days.
Yeah, well, these things, they go in waves.
Yeah, that's true. History tends to do that.
And which is, and that's one of the things I really saw learning on this. There was like a period between the early, like the 800s, 900s up to the early 10 1100s. There was really this dip in what was considered, universities or education just kind of wasn't that important. And then as the society got more complex and needed more administration, and as we got more sources of new and interesting information, it picked back up steam. So a royal secretary, most likely they would gone for a basic bachelor's degree, including grammar and rhetoric and logic, are going to be incredibly useful for acting in any ministerial position. You know, the ability to there's stories of secretaries helping to. I'm trying to remember which book, what it was. It was, I think it was the French king trying to communicate with the Pope and having to have a secretary read it off to him in Latin. So having someone that could speak and read good Latin could make those arguments for you would be very useful. And then depending on how far and how important that secretary would want to be, from the common civil law would obviously be very useful. So the ability to help make those legal arguments and um, fashion them, figure out what might be going on.
No, thank you very much. I'm asking because I've been researching a little bit for a work of fiction I'm working on, and I didn't know where to start with the research for this, but I was trying to find more information about Etienne du Castel, Christine de Pisan's husband, because he seems to have studied under Thomas de Pisan from the University of Bologna, who's like a court astrologer, probably science degree, and has this close relationship with him. But then his career path as a Picardian is as a royal secretary. So I was just wondering if there's any accounts or further reading that might either kind of support like a change of career path or support in that in regard.
Yeah, so Bologna was really famous for its legal training, both civil and canon. So I don't know the particular individual you're talking about. When was he around?
I believe he had a short life. He's more overshadowed by his wife, the
Or,
writer Christine de
mhm.
Pizan. But he seems to have lived from maybe 1354 to 1380 or 1389. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. So the humanist revolution, where they really started focusing more on sciences and those hard, um, a lot of what we consider the high educated, that really started more in the 1400s. So I would focus, so the liberal arts, especially rhetoric, would be really big with them. Um, but the being from Bologna, almost certainly legal training is what would be the highest focus.
Were women ever allowed into the universities?
Not during the period. Like much of the medieval world, it was limited, and because they were often considered clerks, so not full priests, but they were part of the church itself. So they didn't allow women in, though the cathedral schools would. So the women could get education in some of the basic liberal arts or basic grammar through the cathedral schools.
Were there any famous ones?
There's a story. One of the stories do mention someone who someone who snuck in. I don't remember her name specifically, but broke in and you know was exposed then and kicked out. There is a famous just before the universities. Heloise was the lover of Abelard, and she was considered very educated, um, which is part of why he was in a relationship and um, their weird on and off again, on again relationship. But she's a pretty cool character, Heloise.
What were the age limitations?
So generally speaking, you would have some younger students, um, some in their 14, 16, 18, but you also did have a lot of older students too. They mentioned specifically Bologna because of the nature, like legal training. You would have people showing up in their 20s and 30s who were, just enrolling in the school because they needed this training and this new knowledge to be able to advance, sort of like career advancement. So it is a lot like our schools where as far as my reading could show, the predominantly would be younger, but there's a lot of non-traditional students involved as well. Any other questions?
So many, so many. uh, Politically, I can see that this certainly was influenced by politics. And I'm guessing that through your research, you found a lot of politics being influenced through educational systems. That's
Yeah.
just guesswork.
Oh no, totally. So the politically, the universities were definitely a hotbed of sort of pushing society, pushing reform. So the church, the like the thinkers in the university were constantly getting punished or reprimanded by the church leaders for pushing thinking, pushing questioning of dogma too far. They came up with this interesting concept, which is that something can be true philosophically, but false theologically, or true theologically, but false philosophically. And that was sort of their gateway to, well, yes, I can prove that, this, like some of the sacrament of, transubstantiation, saying, well, if it doesn't make sense philosophically, that's because it's true theologically, and it doesn't have to make sense philosophically. Or I can make some argumentation philosophically about the shared nature of the soul, but that's just true philosophically. It's not, it can be ignored theologically.
Which is probably how they maintained their existence.
Yes. And an interesting part of the way they worked with the or interacted with the politics is that the Joan of Arc, her trial was run by the University of Paris, both of them, both her while she was alive and then her posthumous trial.
Well, this is pretty fascinating to me. I'm pondering some of the things I heard and how words have carried over, and grammar school, for instance. How many hundreds of years? My father still called it grammar school when he was a child. And I just think that's wonderful.
Yeah, no, that was definitely an interesting thing to find. Alan? Oh, endowments. Yes. So I know in Oxford, a lot of the colleges that exist in Oxford were specific endowments. And I haven't dove in too deeply into that section, but like New College and Queen's College and all those were specifically an endowment given to the university to train a specific set of students for a specific goal.
Thank you. I was also wondering too, with that, like, so is there any information for the University of Paris doing the same thing?
Yeah. Yeah, they had the same kind of colleges. The source I was looking on was using Oxford as an example of that kind of system, because the names have still persisted to this day. So it's a little bit easier to talk about them.
Thank you.
And all right, any other questions?
I'm sort of wondering what percentage of the general population actually attended some of these universities. Do you have a clue about that? That's kind of an obscure thing, but
Oh no, totally. That's a great question. I'm not sure. I haven't seen anything that gives information on that.
wondering how that would compare to the modern day.
Yeah, given the sort of the nature of feudalism, with the large rural peasants, I would assume it's pretty low. I mean, their ruling class was an incredibly small percentage of the society, so I can't imagine the educated class would be much bigger. But yeah, I don't have anything I was able to find that talked about that.
Thank you. Alan has his hand up.
Yes, you were talking about problems between the town and Gown.
Mhm.
I don't think that it ever was quite as amazingly put as at the St. Scholastica Day riot. That would have been period 1355, where it started out as a barroom brawl. Students were complaining about the quality of the wine and got very out of hand. And over 3 days, close to 100 people died in the rioting.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember, was that the one up in Oxford?
Yes, that's Oxford.
Yeah, because I didn't remember the specific name, but I did remember there was a very large incident up in Oxford, and then for the next, I think it was 50 years, the mayor of the town was required annually to go to the Oxford and repent for the town, offending the university.
Oh, dear me, 50 years? No.
Something like that. I forget the exact time frame, but
Oh, 500.
oh,
Seriously, they were paying fines until 1825, I think it was.
Well, that would encourage you to serve pretty good wine, wouldn't it?
Yeah. The thing to remember was Oxford and Cambridge were both very much under royal patronage. So when the town, strung up perhaps 60 scholars, the king was not going to have that. And a lot of these were people that were going into clergy, and the church was not going to have that either. So I think for a period of 2 years, Oxford was under interdict, which means that no religious ceremonies, not weddings, not burials, nada. The only thing that would be allowed would be baptisms, because you want to make sure the kids get baptized. You don't want them dying unbaptized. That was it for 2 years. They might as well just barred the doors of the churches. So it was pretty stern stuff. And the annual fine was 1 penny for every student that died. So I suppose inflation being what it is, students' life aren't worth as much today as they were back then.
yeah, no, it's a great story. Like I said, I ran across it in passing, but I hadn't written the specifics of it down. But they did some crazy stuff.
So students haven't changed.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely lots of stories of student carousing and, yeah, so like murder and just getting, this university thing going to bat for them, which is definitely seems a bit off these days.
A little extreme.
Well, now coming from University Town, it still it still exists where somebody who is a university student is accused of something, criminal law, and the university somehow manages to get itself involved. And that's never good when that happens. But this is a problem that goes back to the medieval times.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's people that haven't changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that long for the human species.
I'm curious, how many here have been to college of any level?
I have.
We've got a little,
That's
where is that? Reactions. On your reactions, put your hand in the air if you've been to college. A little over half. Can't find it, huh, Lori? You can put your hands down. Well, I enjoyed that very much. I learned quite a bit. And I'm intrigued now. I want to go learn more.
Yeah, well, I said I dropped in both the chat and on the Facebook site all the books I was reading and using to help out my research. So there's a fair amount of them.
That's great. If you put them in the conversation underneath this event's link on the Facebook page, they will live on, but everything in the chat disappears once this meeting closes.
Yeah, I dropped them on the Facebook,
Awesome.
the
Awesome.
event. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
I really appreciate your doing this. I have recorded it a little belatedly. And
Did it too, even if I was jumping up to get a sandwich and doing other things while you were talking.
and I'm going to be posting the link for that recording also in the comment section underneath this event. I've been a little slow getting those out there because it's been I had them saved to the cloud, and I'm not tech good at all. Everybody who knows me knows that. But my granddaughter, who is my techie guru, has been trying to help me translate them from the cloud to the computer. I'm skipping that. I just recorded this one to the computer. It'll be much easier. But I will be putting them on the event, so you can go back and listen again if you've missed things.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, this group is a chatty lot ordinarily. Nobody has to leave at 8 or 9 o'clock or whatever the time the computer says. We just hang around and talk until everybody's ready to quit. You're welcome to join us. And if you feel like running away, you can do that too.
I think I'm going to go ahead and finish my dinner. So.
Oh, thank you so much for interrupting dinner for us.
Oh, not a problem at all. It was enjoyable. I'm glad we got to do it.
Really enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Hey, well.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of glad to stay because now I can show you my pretty threes I was talking about in the beginning.
That's right. That's right.
I finally managed to.
And
Bye-bye.
thank you so much for the garb too.
Oh yeah.
Missed it. That was fun.
That was fun. He did a lot of research for that one. That's the sort of class in high school I would have fallen asleep. I had no interest in history in high school, none at all. Got to college, all that changed, but in high school, I didn't care. So,
History
3.
was always my favorite subject, as
Really?
long as there was any story involved. The problem was is most of the things they wanted you to tell them back about when it came to a test was not what happened, but when it happened, and give them a date and the correct spelling of a name. And I can't
Dates and
spell,
times.
and numbers don't work.
Yeah.
So if you want to hear the story, if I've heard a story, I can tell you the story, but I can't tell you the numbers and the spelling. Those are the two. So even though the stories, if like, I can be a great storyteller. It's just when you're tested on things, it depends on what you're tested on. I would compete with anybody in storytelling.
Yeah, my history teachers in high school were anything but inspiring. I got to college my first year, took American history, and he was quite the fellow. He brought a piano, wheeled a piano in the first day, came pushing it in. And he would sing campaign songs from the Civil War. He came in costume. He just brought it to life, told the stories, made it real. Changed everything for me.
Yeah, I didn't really do well in most history classes, except for the one where we got to the American Civil War, or not the American Civil, the American Revolutionary War. And the only reason we had that was because when I was a wee toddler, my dad had purchased an album of Revolutionary War songs.
I didn't even know that it still existed.
Yeah, so so that was one of, he recorded it onto tape, and that was one of our traveling songs whenever we go for a drive, one of our traveling tapes. And so we learned all these songs. So, history, big old struggle for freaking names and dates. Couldn't get it. All of a sudden, we hit the American Revolutionary War. I'm just like, I am there. I know the names of ships. I know battle plans. I know where it all took place because it's all in the songs.
Well, you have a really sharp mind. I know you well enough to say that. And I think you were just bored and didn't care to listen.
That's also very likely, it's very definitely a factor. But you put anything to music and my attention will be there.
Yeah.
Sing it, you'll never forget it.
Oh yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Remember?
Schoolhouse
Rock?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
People in all form of more perfect union. I remember that.
Yep.
I think there's a couple of us here old enough to remember. You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent.
Oh,
That's like, that it's old. I was pre-kindergarten, but I remembered it because it was to music.
Right?
My mother was actually offered. I have a picture that's partly damaged, sadly, because I didn't listen to that little voice that said, "Put pieces of paper in between them. They've got tape on the back." But in any case, a picture of my mother sitting on a beach towel, and she was offered a good amount of money for a picture of her smile for a Pepsodent commercial.
Oh my gosh.
And apparently she turned it down. It was just a note scrawled on the picture. I'm gonna have to bring some of those into Photoshop and see if I can fix them, because I was so dumb. There's a triangular piece of the print torn out of my brother's head in the bathtub.
Oh no.
Oh well, but they were going, "Come on, Lori, we have to get you to your plane. We're gonna box all this stuff up and send it to you. Come on. And I said, okay, let me get these. And I pulled them off the board. It was my father's.
Oh dear.
Oh.
Stuck them in an envelope, and of course then I could not get them apart properly.
Right.
The things you do when you think, if I could go back in time and say, don't do that.
Yeah.
I think we all have those pieces in our lives.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the oldest jingle you can remember from advertising?
Oh geez.
Chewy, Nature Valley Chewy, granola bars.
Oh my God. Yes.
Oh yeah.
Oh jeez.
That the reason we didn't have a television, but my friends recorded the Star Wars movie when it came out in the 1980s on TV, and they recorded it, and it was really cool because it had little snippets.
I think we lost your audio, dear.
That was an interesting sound effect, though.
Mhm.
Yes.
Alan, come on. I know you can remember some jingles.
Who wants to see the pictures
3.
for the number 3?
Let us see 3.
To show you my process, I would actually have to share screens. Is that okay?
It's still there.
Okay, so share screen.
But you are still recording.
Oh, we're going to stop that recording.
Yeah, who wants to see that?
Nobody else needs
Oh
to
yeah,
see
yeah.
that.